So let's look at what else happened. Darwin himself, remember that Darwin's an invalid, and uh, he had good days and bad days, but social contact tended to just wreck him. Just having friends over for dinner would leave him exhausted on the couch for days. Um, so, when a scientist presents ideas, they're kind of expected to present them publicly at meetings and things like that, and be willing to debate them in print and maybe in speeches and things. Darwin was really too ill to do most of that. But his inner circle of friends took on the job of promoting his ideas. Notably, a young biologist by the name of Thomas Henry Huxley. Um, Huxley was trained as a physician and was actually, I mentioned that Wallace had been in the tropics poking around on islands. Huxley had been the ship's doctor on board another one of those survey voyages that the Royal Navy was taking, Her Majesty's ship Rattlesnake. And so he'd explored the tropics in a ship, and had been to Australia, published some works on Australian jellyfish, things like that. So he had had a lot of these same experiences that the young Darwin did, and he read The Origin of Species and later said that his reaction was, "How stupid of me not to have thought of that." He was such a promoter of Darwinian's ideas that he became known as Darwin's bulldog. And as he wrote, "I trust you will not allow yourself to be in any way disgusted or annoyed by the considerable abuse and misrepresentation which is in store for you. You must recollect that some of your friends are endowed with an amount of combativeness. I am sharpening up my claws and beak in readiness." Now, Huxley was still not a mindless fanboy. He admitted this was the best idea out there, but he still felt that there wasn't really conclusive demonstrations that natural selection worked. As he said, "An extremely valuable and in the highest degree probable doctrine, indeed the only extant hypothesis which is worth anything, but still a hypothesis and not yet the theory of species." Oh, I'll mention this just to make a connection here. Huxley was not only noted as a scientist and a science writer, he was also an advocate for educational reform. And he visited the United States in 1876 and gave a speech at the first opening of a new type of university, at least new in the United States. It was patterned on a model that Germany was using in its educational system. The curriculum was based not on Greek and Latin and theology, but on science and modern languages, and emphasized doing research. In fact, it was the first university that offered the PhD degree as a research degree. It was one of the first universities in the United States that pioneered the kind of college curriculum that you folks are used to. Um, if anybody's curious, it was Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, Maryland, one of the first universities to follow the type of curriculum that you know. And Huxley was an advocate for this sort of education and gave a speech at the opening of Johns Hopkins. There were some that were absolutely horrified. This is Darwin's old geology professor, Adam Sedgwick, great geologist, ordained minister, horrified at what his pupil had done, claiming that Darwin was denying the moral or metaphysical part of nature as well as the physical. A man who denies this is deep in the mire of folly. Oh, not very happy with how his student has turned out, feeling that Darwin's theory ignores, morals and ethics and spirit. I mentioned Agassiz, the guy who lost his shit when he got served by black waiters in Philadelphia and was so terrified that he ended up becoming a polygenist. He also carried on the old traditions of natural theology and was one of the few genuinely respected scientists who always opposed evolution. By about 10 years after Darwin published, just about everybody who had studied the matter accepted some kind of biological evolution for, a theory for the diversification of life. Agassiz was one of the few that never did. As he wrote, this is straight up natural theology. Paley could have written this. All these facts in their natural connection proclaim aloud the one God whom man may know, adore, and love. And natural history must in good time become the analysis of the thoughts of the creator of the universe. Study the living world enough and you'll get inside God's head and you'll know what he was thinking. And again, there's that doctrine of the book of God's word and the book of God's works, both leading you together to the fullest possible understanding of God. Agassiz is all about this stuff, and Agassiz is one of the few who never went with any kind of evolutionary theory. Not Darwin's and not anybody else's. Now, Agassiz was opposed, but there were people who, then there was religious objection to this. Probably the funniest was a guy by the name of Philip Henry Goss, who wrote a long book arguing that God created all life just as it looks today a few thousand years ago in the Garden of Eden, but he had to create life and by extension create the entire earth with the appearance of age, that God had to put the fossils in the rocks and the rock layers and the coal deposits and things like that as part of his plan to make the earth look like it was truly old. The title of the book is Omphalos, which is Greek for navel, right? The belly button, because a fun little question to ask yourself, I guess, is did Adam and Eve have navels? Right? Because your navel comes from where your umbilical cord was when you were inside your mother's uterus. But Adam didn't have a mother. Did he have a navel, which would be the sign that he had an umbilical cord, even though he was never in anybody's uterus? Goss argued that he did, and that just like Adam's navel, God had to have created the entire earth with signs as if it was old, even though it wasn't really. The book really didn't please anyone and is kind of forgotten now, probably just as well. That was one of probably the most extreme religious reaction. There were certainly people like Sedgwick who reacted more on moral grounds, but there were religious people at the time who were perfectly good with this. This is Asa Gray. He's a botanist, probably the founding father of North American botany. His textbook is still in print, even though, he's been dead for 130 plus years. You can still get Gray's Botany, much updated by later people. And he was Darwin's only American contact in the inner circle. And he accepted evolution perfectly well, but always believed that God was directing the whole thing. As he put it, one who believes in the existence of a creator will see in natural variation, the struggle for life and natural selection, only the order or mode in which this creator in his own perfect wisdom sees fit to act. Happy is he who can thus see and adore. Evolution's happening the way the scientist says, but God is ultimately working through it, causing his purposes to come into existence by means of evolution. That's a position called theistic evolution. It is still popular today. There's Ken Miller's book. We have a copy in the library called Finding Darwin's God. Might be worth a read if you are interested in this issue. This is the kind of thing my mother told me when I started having questions about the Bible and the fossils and all that when I was 6, I think. And it's a position a lot of people take. There was a rather more sinister direction that it took. This is Francis Galton, who was actually Charles Darwin's cousin, a founding father of modern statistics with a mind that just obsessed over reducing everything to numbers and then analyzing them. He took this in a rather spooky direction because he thought that humans should take artificial selection and apply it to themselves and improve their own species. And he called this idea eugenics. As he wrote, he had no patience with the hypothesis that babies are born pretty much alike, and the sole agencies in creating differences between boy and man are steady application and moral effort. It wasn't your education and your work ethic that would make you succeed or fail. It was your genes, as we'd say now. And humans ought to use their knowledge of artificial selection to improve their own species. This really took off in the United States, in part because this is also the time, starting at about the 1870s, when you start getting this rising tide of the established American population starting to freak out, as they do, about these immigrants. America was filling up, it seemed, with Italians and Irish and Swedes and Norwegians and Poles and Russians and all of these things. There's also the ever-present presence of the African American populations, who may be technically free by 1870, but they sure as heck are not equal yet. And there were some people that worried that this influx of immigrants was going to drag the country down because they were bringing in, lower quality, well, we'd now say genes, although the word was not coined yet, that they were going to drag the country down because they were going to outbreed the old colonial stock of proper Americans, who believed in freedom and liberty and the value of a dollar and the value of a good day's work and all of that stuff. America starts having a real problem with how to deal with diversity at about this time. We're not really over it yet. And eugenics took off like wildfire. Groups like Fitter Families for Future Firesides started spreading the word with exhibits. This is at, I think, a Texas county fair. They've set up a eugenics and health exhibit. They even sponsored things like beauty contests, just like a farmer might enter his prize cows or sheep or chickens or pigeons and get judged on them and maybe win a ribbon. You could enter your children or possibly your entire family at contests sponsored by these pro-eugenics groups and get them judged and win a blue ribbon for having the best baby or the best, family overall. So groups like this, groups like the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in New York, the Eugenics Records Office, put out propaganda in favor of eugenics, encourage people to compile pedigree charts and, trace, good or bad personality and character traits here. Here's a poster showing how eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. Like a tree, eugenics draws its materials from many sources and organizes them into a harmonious entity. It sounds good until you remember that part of eugenics was negative eugenics, meaning discouraging the unfit from having babies. There was a silent movie that was a sensation in 1917 called The Black Stork, and it dramatized a real life case of a doctor that refused to save the life of a baby born with birth defects. In a sensational court date, the doctor was found not guilty, and the publicity drummed up support for eugenics across the country. The Eugenics Records Office in Cold Spring Harbor, New York, lobbied for laws that would keep the unfit from breeding. And in 1907, Indiana passed a law mandating the surgical sterilization of the, quote, feeble minded. If a doctor deemed you to be feeble minded, you could have your tubes tied, male tubes, female tubes, whichever the case might be. This was easier to do back in the day because the way that the mentally ill and developmentally disabled were cared for, if care is quite the word, was put in state institutions. Arkansas used to have a big state home for the, I can't remember exactly what they called it, the mentally deficient or something like that. If memory serves, it was in Dardanelle, some big state institution for people who couldn't be part of society was located in Dardanelle, Arkansas. And if you got committed to one of those, you might spend your entire life there, pretty much at the mercy of the staff. Those all started closing down in the 1960s. But if you were put in one of those institutions, you were going to get your tubes tied whether you wanted them or not. 30 states ended up passing such laws, sterilizing about 60,000 Americans. As of last I checked, maybe 5 to 10 years ago, Arkansas is one of 10 states that still has a law like this on the books, mandating the surgical sterilization of the, quote, feeble-minded. To the best of my knowledge, nobody's actually tried to use that law. It's one of these stupid laws that sticks around on the books and isn't enforced, but nobody ever bothers to repeal. So I don't think this is still going on. But yeah, up until the 1970s, it happened. If you got judged to be feeble-minded by a judge. There was a famous Supreme Court case called Buck v. Bell. Ooh, that's going to be on the reading I'm going to give you this afternoon. The Supreme Court case that upheld the constitutionality of this sort of thing. Right. They were seen as enlightened progressive laws at the time. You know, instead of wasting your money trying to care for people who could never contribute to society, you know, the most humane thing you could do is just make sure they wouldn't breed more like themselves. And then society would not have to bear the burden of caring for future generations of people who are incapable of caring for themselves. It sounds like a good idea until you remember how terribly prone to abuse it is. I mentioned there were these state institutions for the feeble-minded. If you were a man and you got married to a woman who already had kids and you wanted to get rid of her kids so that you could have kids with her and you didn't like your stepkids, it was not unheard of to have those stepkids declared feeble-minded. So some of the people who were sterilized in institutions did have mental illness or developmental delays. Some of them got sterilized because they were, you know, girls being sexually adventurous at a time when you weren't supposed to do that. They were perfectly normal. They just got caught petting with the wrong boy. And some of them were perfectly normal, whose only real crime was they were getting in the way of stepdad. Terrible possibilities for abusing this. but they won the enthusiastic support and careful attention of certain politicians in Germany in the 20s and 30s. Um, German euthanization of people deemed to be unfit, including not just Jews and Romani people, but the physically and mentally handicapped as well. They learned that from us. Um, we are not as much the good guys as we'd sometimes like ourselves to believe. Anyway, little sobering thought for you to take with you into the day, and you'll get some background readings on this that will give you some more information. This is the first topic I want us to discuss in our upcoming labs, not this week, but next. Anyway, Origin of Species comes out and evidence begins to accumulate that supported biological evolution. One of these is this fossil. This is Archaeopteryx lithographica, turned up in a limestone quarry in South Germany in 1862. And if you've not heard of Archaeopteryx, you can't see all of the details here, but this is an incredibly well-preserved fossil. Most fossils don't show you this level of detail, but the whole skeleton is there. There's claws on the hands, hooked claws. The thing's got an elongated, bony tail. You can't see it in this fossil, but there's more than one fossil of Archaeopteryx. The breastbone is flat. There's ribs in the abdomen area, belly ribs or gastralia, and you can't see them in this picture, but the mouth is full of teeth. There's some teeth. And this thing looks like a small dinosaur. It's not grossly different from raptors, except for the fact that it's well enough preserved that you can see the outlines of feathers. This thing probably could fly, probably wasn't a great flyer, but we think it was in fact capable of powered flight. And yet it has all these features that are very typical of reptiles and specifically of dinosaurs. Modern birds don't have teeth. Modern birds have a stumpy tail. As you know, if you've ever seen a whole chicken plucked. Modern birds have a keeled breastbone, not a flat one. Modern birds don't have claws on their wing. Like I said, this does not look like a modern bird, except for the fact that, holy crap, it's got wings and feathers and can fly. There's also the discovery, right as the Origin of Species is coming out, of stone tools like these. Now, stone tools had been picked up for probably thousands of years. Just the way that, you can pick up arrowheads in parts of Arkansas if you just, walk around in the fields enough. People in Europe had been picking up stone tools for quite a long time. In some areas, there were folk beliefs about them. But in 1858 and 1859, tools like this were found conclusively associated with the bones of extinct animals, bones that even had cut marks from being butchered. So that showed that humans or human relatives that were capable of making very sharp and effective stone tools were around at the same time that extinct mammals like woolly mammoths and woolly rhinos and giant elk and things like that had been alive. And that suggests humanity is much older than anybody had suspected. And even the discovery of this is a skull that turned up in 1856 in the valley of a German river called the Neander River. The word for a valley in German is Tal. So this skull came from the Neanderthal. Heard of it? Neanderthals? This is the first find of a Neanderthal. Although Neanderthals have been found all across Europe and all the way into Central Asia, by the way. And this skull looks pretty human. The brain is actually as big as yours, if not a tiny bit bigger, but it's anatomically very different. The brows are huge. The skull vault is very elongated and low. Yours looks like an inflated balloon by comparison. The midface projects forward and there's no chin. Now, these people walked fully upright and they made those stone tools that I showed you and were skilled hunters. They weren't brutes, they weren't stupid, but yet they're consistently anatomically different from modern Homo sapiens. You can tell them apart without too much difficulty. So that raised the uncomfortable question: could these be human ancestors? That's the first solid evidence we're getting that humanity did not always look like it does now. There'd be a lot more found in the 20th century, mostly in Africa. That's a whole nother story. Maybe I never have time to include as much as I would like to, but maybe I'll try this summer. Maybe we can talk about that later. But suffice it to say that right about now is when we start, come on, Wagoner, finding evidence that Darwin might actually have been right, that man might actually have the indelible stamp of humble ancestry. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, by about 1870, just about every scientist who's put some time into studying the matter is down with the idea of some kind of natural evolution that happens by processes that scientists can study. What was actually in decline was the idea that natural selection caused it. Most scientists didn't think natural selection by itself could possibly be responsible for all of the change that we see in the living world, from the goo to the zoo to you. That wasn't widely accepted for about another 50 to 60 years. Thomas Henry Huxley's grandson, Julian Huxley, a noted biologist in his own right, called this, quote, the eclipse of Darwinism. Oh, minor connection. Julian Huxley's brother and Thomas Henry Huxley's grandson, another grandson, was an author named Aldous Huxley, who's probably best known for a novel called Brave New World that you might have read at some point, about a sinister, negative utopia, future society where babies are born in jars. And anyway, you should read it. So why is there this eclipse? Some argued that the Earth couldn't possibly be old enough. Darwin had always emphasized that natural selection is incredibly slow and gradual. Every generation, you might only get, a millimeter or less change in the shape of a bird beak or something like that, but add up millimeter scale changes over millions, endless millions of years, and you could explain it all. But some argued the Earth wasn't old enough. You couldn't have infinite time for natural selection to work. There was the argument that favorable variants couldn't be selected for because interbreeding would wash out that variation. Nobody could explain, not Darwin and not anybody else, where variation came from or how it got inherited. I mean, it does get inherited. You can see that in your own family, but where's it come from? And there's also the fact that natural selection did not seem like a good scientific law because it doesn't have predictive value. It's like history in that you can try to explain things after they happen, but you can't predict things very far in advance before they happen. As the scientist, the astronomer John Herschel said, natural selection was, quote, the law of higgledy-piggledy. It doesn't reduce things to some kind of order the way that, Newton's laws of gravity explain the orbits of the planets and allow you to predict them long in advance. Natural selection doesn't really let you do that. So real quick, fellow by the name of Fleming Jenkin, a Scottish engineer, argued that natural selection had a serious flaw coming from what he called blending inheritance. And it works like this. Let's say you've got a population of short-necked giraffes, and they're all standing around eating leaves off of trees. And from somewhere, what animal breeders called a sport of nature, we now call it a mutation, boom, there's a long-necked giraffe born, a giraffe with a hugely long neck that can eat leaves off of the tallest trees. Okay, that's great. Our long-necked giraffe is much less likely to starve because he can eat all of these leaves that the other giraffes can't. He's not competing with them. So he grows strong and healthy, and he eventually hits giraffe puberty and starts thinking about making babies. But who does he mate with? Our long-necked giraffe can only mate with short-necked giraffes because that's all that's there. So he might live very well and get lots of food and have lots of babies, but the babies, let's say, are all going to be medium-necked giraffes, assuming that they come in between the phenotype of the parents. So our long-necked giraffe has only medium-necked giraffe offspring. When they grow up, unless they mate with each other, which, ew, let's not even go there, our medium-necked giraffes are only going to have short-necked giraffes to mate with. And so you end up with a third generation of medium short necks. And unless they marry their cousins, they're going to marry short-necked giraffes and have even shorter-necked offspring. And so over generations, that favorable trait is going to end up being kind of like putting a drop of red paint into a bucket of white paint. Stirring is going to make that red paint just spread out and eventually become invisible. Or like putting a drop of red food coloring into a bucket of clear water. As that drop expands, it's going to spread out and the red color gets fainter and fainter until eventually you can't even tell it's there. Jenkin argued the same thing would happen for any favorable variation in a population. It would get diluted out by breeding with individuals that didn't have that trait. An even more formidable opponent was William Thomson, a Scottish physicist who was so knowledgeable about engineering and specifically thermodynamics that he got made a baron, the lowest level of nobility, and took on the name Lord Kelvin. You know him by this name because they named a temperature scale after him. I know you know about the Kelvin scale. Well, Kelvin was the world's top expert in the thermodynamic physics, and he argued that the Earth could not be old enough for the millions and millions and cajillion, billion, squillion, gazillion years that natural selection would need to generate all of biodiversity from the very beginning, from the primordial scum all the way to Marjorie Taylor, what's her name, Greene. There just wasn't time for all of that to evolve. And he argued like this: we know that the Earth is hot on the inside because we have volcanoes. We know that if you dig into the Earth, if you dig mines, it gets hotter the deeper you go. The deepest mines in the world are, I think, gold mines in southern Africa that go down something like 2 miles, and the temperature down there is 150 Fahrenheit. And you have to have this just insane air conditioning system, or else people couldn't work in there at all. You can't sustain physical labor at 150 degrees Fahrenheit, you die. And so we know the Earth has internal heat. It increases in depth at a rate of roughly 1 degree Fahrenheit for every 70 feet down, or if you like, 1 degree Celsius for every 40 meters, or about 25 Celsius per kilometer. Now we know that any warm body in space is radiating that heat away. It's giving off what we call black body radiation. And we can measure the rate governed by the laws of physics. And Kelvin could only do rough calculations, but he did them. And he calculated that for the Earth to have as much heat as it now does, and for it to be losing heat at the rate that it is losing it, estimated, the Earth would have to have been molten, melted all through much too recently for Darwinian evolution to have had time to have major effects. So he estimated that the Earth must have cooled and formed a crust somewhere between 20 million years ago and 400 million years ago. Life, of course, has to be even younger because life couldn't appear until after the Earth's crust had cooled down. So that puts a limit on the length of time that evolution has to work. It's still really big. 20 million years is still inconceivably large from the point of view of a human lifespan, but it's not indefinitely long. Natural selection doesn't have enough time, Kelvin said, for evolution to proceed all the way from the goo to the zoo to you. Huxley tried to defend the possibility that the Earth was a lot older, but Kelvin's words still carried a lot of weight because he had math. I used to have a sticker that I thought about putting on my office door that I never did because I decided I didn't need that kind of trouble. It was a cartoon of a grinning scientist, and the caption was, "We have charts and graphs, so F off." It didn't say F off, it was a little more direct. I decided not to put that up because, somebody's going to get bothered. But that was kind of Kelvin's approach. He had done his math correctly. He knew the math better than anybody. He founded thermodynamics. Huxley argued that, things like the amount of Earth's heat and the rate of radiation were still not precisely known enough to give you a definite result. The greatest mill in the world will not extract wheat flour from peas, and the greatest mathematical formulas in the world will not get a definite result out of loose data. Still, Kelvin's words do carry a considerable amount of weight here. There were also a number of scientists who accepted evolution by natural selection up to a limit, but when it came to explaining major changes or big features or human uniqueness, something else had to be involved. Alfred Russel Wallace kind of tarnished his reputation a bit towards the end of his life because he believed that evolution could not explain the origin of the soul, that man might have evolved his physical form, but something must have given him a soul, creating an unbridgeable difference between man and the other animals. And Wallace got into spiritualism, trying to contact the dead with seances and, table rapping and things like that towards the end of his life. Huxley suggested that maybe Darwin had been too hasty, assuming that all change was going to be very slow and gradual. He suggested that you could have change, very rapid change from one generation to the next, a theory he called saltation, from Latin saltare, meaning to jump, that evolution might make discontinuous leaps. As he wrote in a letter, I see you are inclined to advocate the possibility of considerable saltus on the part of Dame Nature. I always took the same view, much to Mr. Darwin's disgust, and we used often to debate it. There again, Huxley was a big Darwin fanboy, but not an uncritical one. He differed with Darwin on many points, even as he was promoting Darwin's ideas as the best that anybody had going. And even Darwin never ruled out Lamarckian evolution. There was a whole school of neo-Lamarckian evolution at about this time that rediscovered Lamarck's ideas. And the advantage of Lamarckian evolution is it happens faster because you're not sitting around waiting for a variation to appear. Organisms cause themselves to vary in ways that make them adapt to the environment. As Darwin wrote in the last edition of Origin of Species, something talking about variability, something may be attributed to the definite action of the conditions of life. Some, perhaps a great effect, may be attributed to the increased use or disuse of parts. That's Lamarck right there. Yeah. But what that but is, we're going to have to wait till Friday to find out. By about 1900, most people don't accept natural selection as the prime mover of evolution. It probably had some effect, but at best, it would be one cause among many. And a lot happened to put natural selection back in the driver's seat again, beginning around the year 1900, answering these objections. But I am out of time. So by the power vested in me by the state of Arkansas, I'm going to stop the recording for now.